there's a mindset shift that needs to happen where the team need to get both cars round that first corner and get to fighting at the front, not fighting each other.
They're going to have to start making decisions about who their number one driver is. They're going to have to start to prioritise.
I mean, Fernando will be going when he's in a Zimmer getting into the car.
Hello and welcome to On Track GP, where today Jamie and myself are discussing, is there a rivalry brewing at Mercedes? Have we seen the beginning of something quite big and dramatic happening in Formula One? So most recently, in the most recent race, Jamie, we saw in turn one, Lewis Hamilton drive into the back of George Russell. His instant reaction was like, my teammate's just driven into me, but then seeing the footage, he then, the PR maybe kicked in. He said, I'm happy to take the blame for that, was what he said. That's my role. Not, it was my fault. He said, I'm happy to take the blame, which I thought was quite an interesting choice of words.
It's very diplomatic, I think, and given the history that Lewis has with contact with teammates, this is not something that is new. This is very old hat, and I think he's getting ahead of any controversy curve that might happen with that.
Okay.
In all honesty, watching it back, he is at fault. I think there's not a lot that can be said to argue either way.
I agree. You're not going to see anybody fighting that call. Surely it was Lewis's fault, that particular crash.
Yeah, that particular crash is definitely his fault. And on top of that, it's not a great start for a lot of drivers in the top six getting away. And it did cause a lot of chopping and changing. George has every right to be where he is going into that first corner. I think there's a mindset shift that needs to happen where the team need to get both cars round that first corner and get to fighting at the front, not fighting each other. And George hit the nail on the head a couple of weeks ago where he said, are we racing anyone else apart from ourselves?
Well, that was the quote. And it feels like this has been building and coming to a head. And ultimately, I think Mercedes got away with one a little bit. Somehow they still managed to outscore Ferrari on a weekend where Ferrari looked like they could come back and get them. Mercedes were in an amazing place. Lewis crashes out. George somehow manages to scrape back up and score a fourth, I think he finished in the end. Unfortunately for Mercedes, Carlos Sainz didn't even start the race. So I think Mercedes got away with one. And if this continues into the future, because I think we are going to see a Mercedes resurgence in maybe even 24, but over the next couple of years. We know Lewis, both of them have signed for 2 years, their contracts. They're going to have to start making decisions about who their number one driver is. They're going to have to start to prioritise. Who do you think they should prioritise?
Controversial or not, I think it has to be George. I think,
given
the fact that the argument can be stated now, he is not a rookie driver. He is not a fresh driver. He is a seasoned professional at this point. At some point, you're going to have to say, Lewis, you're going to have to become the mentor, and we're going to have to push George through. George is, for all intents and purposes, the future number one driver at Mercedes. So leaving, whether it be through nostalgia bait or through a sense of loyalty, leaving Lewis to be the sole number one driver isn't going to work. There's no longevity there.
Interesting. So I agree, there is no longevity because ultimately, at his age, he's going to retire. So unless he does a Fernando Alonso and drives to he's 55 or something.
I mean, Fernando will be going when he's in a Zimmer getting into the car.
I do think, yes, I agree that Lewis Hamilton at some point will stop racing before George Russell. But for me, at the minute, George hasn't proven anywhere near enough that he is even maybe the right choice of driver to be the future of Mercedes. And I think right now, you've got to go with your proven entity.
Do you think that's because he's brash, or do you think it's because
he's not winning?
His driving style?
Not won enough for me.
Mercedes haven't won enough in general. For my money, if you take Red Bull out of the equation for the moment and just talk solely Mercedes, Ferrari, McLaren, Mercedes aren't winning enough out of those three teams.
Yeah, correct.
Let alone out of Formula One as a whole. So in that sense, the last person to win a Grand Prix for Mercedes is George.
Well, that is true.
So there is an argument.
Brazil 22, right?
Yeah. Well, he was the only Mercedes driver to score any points, score any wins in 2022. Correct. So there are arguments saying that the pendulum needs to swing towards George. On top of that, George's style, especially when it comes down to qualifying and certainly in terms of longevity, it will outlast what Lewis is doing. Lewis is becoming old hat in terms of the way he's driving. He's not moving with, certainly when you look at Oscar Piastri, Lando Norris, there is a new style of driver coming through. Lewis is at the end of that curve. He's not at the front of it. So I think Mercedes have to bite the bullet at some point and essentially give a mentorship role and get George in the front.
So I would fight that by saying, so yes, you're absolutely right. George Russell has won a race more recently than Lewis Hamilton in a Mercedes. But you look at this season, Lewis is wiping the floor with George. Absolutely wiping the floor. I think George has got 1 podium. Lewis has got 4. He's like 60, 62 points ahead in the drivers.
That definitely is not an arguable point. I definitely can't defend that because the way George has been driving, there is no fight, there is no outcome, there is no product this season, and it's quite evident. Like Lewis being the season pro
should Mercedes be worried about that? Should Mercedes be worried that? Because I take your point in terms of the age thing, but for me, George isn't doing enough to prove, like an Oscar Piastri is, to go, this guy's
That's
the
a perfect example because Lando and Oscar have only had one coming together, like iconic coming together, as opposed to where you look at Mercedes' track record of teammates coming together, it's quite extensive. The issue is George is working harder to take on Lewis than he is to take on Carlos, to take on Charles, even Sergio. So he's working very hard in team. There is infighting going on that Mercedes are having to deal with. And I don't think Toto has got the forthright, for want of a better phrase, the fortitude to say, Lewis, that's enough.
But I don't know if that would be the right decision. I think if Mercedes pull out a car next year, right, that can compete
I hope so.
with Red Bull, or at least compete to start getting them some wins.
At least top 6.
Yeah. They'll
As in top 6 drivers, not top 6 teams.
Hopefully. Down with the likes of Alfa Romeo, yikes. I think if they do pull out a really good car, and they start winning races and they start maybe looking at championships, right? Let's say for the Constructors' Championship, they will have to prioritise a driver, and I think they will prioritise Lewis, and I think they should prioritise Lewis.
Is that tradition and loyalty bait though because of this elusive 8th title?
100%. There's an element of that, but also I think the stats
is that going to be a sort of a bone of contention? Like, will it stick in their craw a little bit that no, we have to get Lewis to the 8th title, as opposed to as a team we have to beat Red Bull, Ferrari, and now McLaren as well. Not so much Aston Martin, because as Aston Martin doing that, Mercedes are doing that. So is it a case of they're going to do it just because it's Lewis? If it happened that Lewis retired after Abu Dhabi and it was Valtteri and George, would they still be saying, no, Valtteri, we must push Valtteri forward?
But I don't think Valtteri's anywhere near as good as Lewis. I think.
But then you're talking about the season pro versus the newer driver.
Well, both of them are, but ultimately nobody knows what would happen next season, right? And I think if you're Mercedes, if you're Toto Wolff, you've got 2 options in front of you. You've got what I think is a much bigger risk in going. When we say unproven about George, by the way, 1 in F2, 1 in F3, has won races, did amazingly at Williams. We're not talking about an idiot. He's a very good driver.
And he's a much better rookie that's come through than some of the more recent rookies. If we look at the issues that Logan Sargent has had, the issues that Lando had first time round, it's not a simple case of he's just a decent driver. He is a proven professional.
Yeah.
So with that in mind, he should be pushed forward.
So I think, there's an argument for it, but I think that's a much bigger risk to go. We're going to give it now all our eggs into George's basket. Lewis, you just need to be a mentor. You need to be a number 2 driver, rather than going, this guy's won 7 world championships. Yep. We know his ability. We know that he is probably the greatest driver of all time, or if not one of the greatest drivers of all time. Just because he's a bit older doesn't mean he doesn't have it anymore. I would say that is a much less of a risk than going full into George now.
So do they start of 2024? Because I think Mercedes have done enough for this season. I think they will finish 3rd, if not 2nd, in the constructors.
Should get 2nd.
They should get 2nd, ideally.
They got away with it this weekend.
Yes,
really.
I mean, Carlos Sainz has helped them out in a huge way. Yeah. I mean, the car just decided it didn't want to race. Yeah, and then also tyre choices are playing a huge factor in where you're going to finish a race. And Mercedes got it on point, to the fact that Red Bull are getting on the radio to Max towards the end of the race and saying, you need to step it up because Oscar's going to catch you. Yeah. So the tyre usage and the tyre wear did play a factor.
George, not to Lewis.
Into George, yes. Do we say then, speculatively for Mercedes, that come start 2024, right, both of you, off you go, who's the best?
I mean, I would love that, because I like it when they just go, see what happens. But if they're close and they're looking to start making a decision, right, we need to prioritise one driver in terms of scoring more points. For me, you have to go with the less of a risk, and Lewis Hamilton is much less of a risk to score points than George is.
No, I agree. I think Lewis, in terms of his decision making and not being hot-headed going into particularly difficult situations like Turn 1, like the Senna S's, where we've had significant Hamilton crashes before. I think that's ebbed away now. So I do agree that in terms of a safety element, they're probably going to go with Lewis. For my money, though, I would want to see them invest in the future and go, yeah, you've probably come through the infighting, you've had a lot to deal with. Let's put some emphasis on George Russell and push George Russell to be the number one moving forward as well, as opposed to just the number one because he's proving to be a development force as opposed to, the senior driver.
Just to throw one out there, in the end, do you think Alex Albon would do a better job than George Russell in that Mercedes this season?
I love this argument because I want to go all the way back to putting George in Lewis's car for one race.
Yes, and he so nearly won it.
That amazing, we put the wrong tyres on your car situation. But I think Formula One has a problem where you can put most Formula One drivers in a good car and they will perform. Albon is a talented driver, and again, another Williams driver. I think George is better.
Okay,
I do think George is better. But in saying that, I don't think, within reason, either of them would be significantly different in that Mercedes car. Put them in a Red Bull, they're winning every week. I think both of them would probably deliver more than Sergio. That's not like sort of slander on Perez as much as it is.
No, it is, and that's fine.
You could put a back marker in the Red Bull and they would still win. I think with Mercedes, replacing George is a difficult one to do. I think the only obvious replacements are Lando, Oscar, and potentially Alex Albon. I don't think there are a lot of drivers that would fill that position, and certainly that would be happy to come into a team and play second fiddle to Lewis.
Yeah, well, and this is it. Well, very, very interesting. Let's finish up. What do you think? What do you realistically think Mercedes can do next year, 24?
Realistically, as opposed to my own personal judgment, I think they are going to go down the tradition, loyalty, push for an 8th title for Lewis. And I think, given Lewis's ability, he is as good as Fernando in that sense. Like he has got longevity. He was one of the few drivers that wasn't complaining about the heat in Qatar. He was one of the few drivers that just knuckled down. Certainly during the sprint race, like he just got on with it. He didn't sit out, he didn't complain. So I think they are going to go with Lewis. I would just love it if they gave George a little bit more to run with.
Yeah, the thing that you said that I find really interesting, I do actually like the idea that they go, right, first 5 races, see what happens.
Who's on top?
And then when you're out of the top 5 races, well, that's going to be who we prioritize. I actually quite like the idea of that, but Lewis would be ahead after 5 races.
I think so too. I think in terms of if they've got a competitive car that is up there with what will be the RB24, RB25, if they're competing there and Lewis is out on top, they're going to go with that. The only danger I would see is if it's 3 and 2. If they've done essentially what happened with Sergio and Max at the start of this season, you've won 2, you've won 2. We're going to just let you.
Yeah.
To be fair, Sergio capitulated his season for himself. Yep. Still going to finish second,
which is unbelievable. And Lewis would have had a chance to be chasing down Sergio this weekend if he hadn't crashed out. So it's difficult. Yeah. It was all to play for, but I think Sergio's going to confirm the second of Mercedes.
To sum it up, there is going to be a rivalry. George isn't going to be happy. But he's not going to go elsewhere. I don't think there's a seat for him elsewhere. But I think he may have to just suck it up and see out till 2025 and see where they are at the end of that season, especially with big rule changes coming in, potential team changes as well. I think suck it up, see how it goes, and maybe he might have to benefit from the team orders of actually finishing races and not fighting with his teammate. Yeah, well, that's a very interesting point. We're going to leave it there. Let us know in the comments what you think about the Hamilton-Russell battle going on at Mercedes. Which side do you sit on? Do you think Lewis is the better driver, or do you think they should look to the future and start to get George in there as their number 1 driver now? But we will leave it. Thank you very much. We are On Track GP. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you very, very soon.